Welcome to another episode of What's at Stake. I'm Ylan Mui, a managing director at Penta. I'm co-hosting with my friend and colleague, Bryan DeAngelis, head of the Washington, D.C. office and partner at Penta. And today we're talking with Ben Ritz, director of the Center for Funding America's Future at the Progressive Policy Institute. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Ben, it's a perfect time to have you on because yet again, we're facing another government funding deadline in March. We just seem to keep getting more dire warnings about the unsustainable national debt from CBO, that's the Congressional Budget Office, and there is maybe a small but hopefully growing bipartisan interest in trying to solve these big problems. So let's start with the immediate issue, keeping the government open, avoiding a shutdown when the money runs out in March. What's the latest in your view there on negotiations? How worried are you about maybe a potential shutdown?
I would say maybe mildly worried, but not seriously. I think what we saw that led us to the last the last deadline and brinksmanship was shutdown was there was a deal for funding levels for this next year that former Speaker McCarthy and President Biden cut in May. They had an agreement. That agreement passed both chambers with a majority of all four parties, House Democrats, House Republicans, Senate Democrats, Senate Republicans. And then like a week later, House Republicans decided they didn't like the deal anymore, and they spent several months trying to negotiate back down to lower levels. And now finally, after many, many months of back and forth, delay, shutdown threats, Speaker Johnson is now back on board with roughly those levels. There were a few changes to some side issues that they discussed, but ultimately now they are back on track for the total levels. They still have to agree exactly how they want to allocate the money up to that level, but I think that the major issues are less thorny than they were in the past.
I think it's so funny to hear you say four political parties, House Republicans, House Democrats, Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, because it feels like four political parties sometimes. And I think that's one of the reasons why the agreement that you mentioned that President Biden and Republicans were able to strike last year was so notable, is because they felt like, we want to make sure that this legislation is actually followed through with. And so they put some kind of poison pills in there, so that if there's not an agreement by, I think it is April 30th, then the stakes could be really high, maybe even worse than a government shutdown.
Yeah, so if they don't reach an agreement by the deadline, then there's an automatic 1% across the board cut to discretionary spending that goes into effect. The agreement was we actually already technically passed the deadline for that cut to take effect, but the way they structured it was the cut happens if we don't have a deal before, but they still have time to undo it before it goes into effect a little later. It's very convoluted, so it hasn't really taken effect yet, but it's just a mess. But yes, the consequences get worse the longer they wait.
And Ben, maybe just a quick follow up there. That 1%, that's defense funding going back to kind of pre-2023 levels in a time of global conflict. That's 1% may sound small, but that's a pretty significant deal.
Yeah. It's 1% across the board to pretty much everything that's not the major entitlement spending programs.
Let me ask you. I think we've all been around Washington a long time, so maybe we've seen this movie before, but this keeps playing out every single year, and there's now talk of a fiscal commission, similar to things we've seen before, but you're advocating for it and thinking about it a lot. So I'm very curious, I'd love to hear from you sort of how you're thinking about it, what it is, what it would do, and even maybe how it might be different from some of the fiscal commissions, Simpson Bowles stuff we've seen in the past.
Sure. So the fiscal commission proposal that's being considered right now is called the Fiscal Stability Act, and it would have the congressional leaders, all four of them, each appoint 3 sitting members of their conference plus 1 outside expert to a commission. So the commission would be 16 members total, evenly split between Democrats and Republicans. And they would weigh policies to improve our debt trajectory. They'd be tasked with getting us back to a sustainable fiscal path in the next 10 to 15 years. And if they came to an agreement on their proposals, those proposals would be fast-tracked for a vote in Congress.
And I mentioned it a little bit, but we've seen similar models before. We did this super committee, I guess about 12, 13 years ago now. We've seen Simpson Bowles. How will this be different? And if you can, I can think of one big difference, which is how our politics have changed. But how are you guys looking
push
at
in the
it?
right direction?
Yeah.
Let's say it might be. I mean, it will be different because no 2 things are going to be exactly the same. But how might it be different in the outcomes? And I'll really stress might. I think it definitely has the potential to not be successful. But so Bowles-Simpson was created by executive order by President Obama. It had a big balance of outside experts and sitting members, and it actually did reach an agreement. A majority of the commissioners from both parties, a supermajority even, voted to support the recommendations. But the commission had a mandate that 3/4 of them had to vote for the proposal to be sent to Congress. And so even though what was called the chairman's mark did have a sizable majority support, it didn't clear that threshold. And so it didn't go directly to Congress. Fast forward a few years later, we have the super committee, and that is it's not an independent commission in the same way that Bowles-Simpson was. It was a joint committee from both chambers of Congress, both parties. It was all sitting members of Congress. There were no outside contributors, and Congress did not consider their recommendations because they didn't have any. They couldn't even get to consensus among themselves. So I think that this commission, having congressional buy-in, not having a supermajority threshold, it has a simple majority, but it requires at least 2 members of each party. So it'll still be bipartisan, but it doesn't have quite the same hurdles as Bowles-Simpson did.
And when you talk about the types of recommendations that they would try to come up with in order to solve our fiscal crisis, essentially, is the floor wide open? I mean, could it be everything from Social Security to cutting taxes to raising taxes? What is the tax base? I mean, is it carte blanche here?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is good about the fiscal commission bill is it doesn't prejudge the outcome. I think if they were to set up a fiscal commission and say, we want to get up to a sustainable budget track, but we're taking all taxes and 60% of spending off the table, or taxes on any household making under $400,000 off the table, and no change to Social Security and Medicare, you're not going to get there. So I don't know what their package would ultimately look like. That's for them to decide. But they do have broad authority to look at pretty much everything.
And if they do agree amongst themselves, if they do reach that simple majority threshold to send their recommendations to Congress, what enforcement action is there, if any, to force Congress to actually consider it?
Yeah, so I mean, this gets into congressional procedure, which I'm not the world's foremost expert on, but essentially, it creates privilege motions to bring it up for a vote. In the Senate, it is not subject to a filibuster to start debate on it. It is still subject to a filibuster to end debate. So to actually pass the bill still requires 60 Senate votes, but a simple majority could begin the debate and start the conversation. So and it gets expedited consideration in the House too. So it does have real teeth to at least encourage consideration of it.
I love this idea in principle, and I don't take this as criticism at all, but I'm very skeptical of the Congress having the fortitude to go through with this. So I've been thinking as I prepare for this, like, what is it going to take for Congress to actually kind of take this serious? And I was struck a couple weeks ago, Fed Chairman Jerome Powell was on 60 Minutes, that there's a man that does not say anything by accident, and really made a big point at the end of that interview to put some emphasis on we've got to solve these issues. I mean, is it going to take more people like Powell and others in those positions really sounding the alarm to kind of wake up Congress and take ideas like this serious?
I don't think it's going to take more people like Powell or even us making that kind of argument. I think it's going to be they're going to have to hear more of it from their constituents.
Yeah.
I think we have seen – I think one thing that's really different now from 2011 is that back then borrowing costs were much lower. Yeah. Interest as a percent of gross domestic product was like something like half of what it is now. Now it's nearing historical highs. It's going to be the highest it's ever been next year. And I think that on top of that, interest rates are higher, so that leads to higher borrowing costs in the private sector. And if constituents start complaining about these things more, I think that would hopefully get the politicians to pay more attention.
To start to act, yeah.
Yeah, well, you did mention this is bipartisan, so it does have Republican and Democrat support. How is leadership thinking about this? Is Speaker Johnson on board, or what is the status of this idea on Capitol Hill?
So Speaker Johnson's on board. When he got elected, he said that enacting a commission along these lines would be one of his top priorities. So House Republicans in an unusual turn of events are not the problem, at least to getting something like this enacted. Although we are seeing, starting to see some more pushback, from some of the further right groups like Americans for Tax Reform, who, the kind of folks who don't want to consider any tax change of any kind. But largely it has leadership support there. Democratic leadership has not been opposed. They just haven't really been in favor of it. And so there's a committed bipartisan group that wants to advance it. We have a good share of both conferences, of all four, being open to it, but not clamoring for it in the way that has pushed it to a vote yet.
Got it. And there are a couple of different versions of this bill floating around there, right?
So there were a couple of different versions for a while. The House had a markup that basically produced a bill that brought the House version and the Senate version pretty close together. So I think for all intents and purposes, the current version of the bill is the Fiscal Stability Act as reported by the House committees. But yeah, there have been a couple other proposals floating around that have been considered too.
What do you think it's going to take for constituents to really start caring? Do you think it's interest rates? Do you think it's concern about their grandkids having to pay off our debt? Or what is your view on how to get the public to understand the crisis that we're facing?
I think it's less a question of getting the public to understand and care so much as be vocal about it. There's been a lot of polling that shows they do increasingly care about it. We did a poll of working class voters late last year and found that inflation and debt contribute. They see the debt as contributing to inflation, and there was a broad desire for this to be one of the top issues Congress tackled. There's been polling from the Peterson Foundation that a few months ago found 60% of voters supporting a fiscal commission. Now it's up to 90% in both parties. So I think the public is increasingly there. It's just this isn't the top issue they're calling about.
Yeah, there'll need to be something, whether it's a campaign or something that agitates this to be the top issue for them. Because I think you're right. Everybody cares about this. You ask anybody, it's a high issue. But when they get to a voting booth, it tends to drop to 6th, 7th, 8th priority. Yeah.
Right. And you think about like Donald Trump versus Joe Biden in the upcoming presidential election, when you think of the list of differences between them, what they would do about the debt is not in the top 5 that somebody is going to think about.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, we're going to talk about politics, a little bit more in depth in just a few minutes. But do you think that if this is not the year for the fiscal commission, do you think it has legs? I mean, do you think this is something that could come up again in 2025, 2026? How long will you all keep pushing for it?
So I want to make a distinction between the fiscal commission and like actual action, like what the commission would produce. I'm I'm not convinced that this isn't the year for the Fiscal Commission. I think there is still a good chance, especially if House Republicans insist on it being part of the final funding bill.
Yeah.
I don't think Democratic opposition is strong enough that would prevent it from it happening. So I think there is still a good chance we get a Fiscal Commission. Now, whether that commission deadlocks like in the super committee, or whether it does produce recommendations but those still don't pass Congress, that's a separate question. I think that I don't know when the right time for action is going to be. I mean, the right time is now, but when the politics are going to align for it, I see a couple action forcing events that could make it more timely. The first one is the expiration of the Trump tax cuts and a lot of the IRA provisions in 2026 or at the end of 2025. I think that's going to be a big moment of reckoning for the broader budget trajectory we're on. If we don't do real action then, or if we just make most of the Trump tax cuts permanent and then just go on our way, I think we then have a few years until we're talking about the exhaustion of the Social Security and Medicare trust funds, and that's probably the next one. If we blow past all of those, I don't know.
We're just in crisis mode.
Yeah, at that point, I'm probably calling it. But I think we have at least a few upcoming ones over the next decade.
Well, let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dive deeper into the Fed and interest rates, the impact on our debt, and what this all means for the 2024 elections.
Penta is the world's first comprehensive stakeholder solutions firm. We are a one-stop shop for the intelligence and strategy leaders need to assess a company's reputation and make decisions that improve their positioning. As executives in the C-suite must account for a growing set of engaged stakeholders, all with distinct, fast-changing demands, Penta provides real-time intelligence and strategy solutions. We work with clients solving complex global challenges across a variety of industries. Our clients span technology, financial services, energy, healthcare, and more. To learn more about how Penta can support your company, check out our website at pentagroup.co, our Twitter at pentagrp, or find us on LinkedIn at Penta Group.
Welcome back to What's at Stake. We're talking with Ben Ritz of the Progressive Policy Institute. And Ben, it feels like we actually have two different problems here. One is a spending and revenue problem, which we've been discussing. But also there's the problem of fast growing interest rates. Net interest payments are one of the fastest growing parts of the national debt. How do you see that factoring into all of these different budget considerations?
Yeah, so the more of our budget that is going to interest payments, the less we have for everything else. Or conversely, if we decide that we're going to continue spending the same amount on everything and more interest payments, that's leading to higher deficits, that leads to more debt, and that leads to more interest costs. So I think in the coming years, we're going to see increased pressure, as we're trying to do more debt service. How are we going to pay for roads and bridges? How are we going to pay for healthcare benefits? I think these problems are going to become more and more pronounced as interest continues to gobble up a growing share of the budget.
Ben, you alluded to this earlier, but to do this right, you have to put everything on the table, and that includes what's often known as the third rail of American politics, right? Social Security reform. And it's a really hard one for candidates. It's always hard in an election year, especially like this one. You can see what happened when Nikki Haley proposed an increase in the retirement age for Social Security. But, it also dawns on me that, no matter what happens in November, we have a lame duck president, and we've got someone that maybe, given that they don't have to stand for re-election again, may want to push something like this. So is this the time when Social Security kind of gets on the table and we have a serious conversation about it?
I think that every president, at least since Clinton, has envisioned, or folks have envisioned, well, in their second term, they can deal with it. I remember us having this conversation about President Obama. Bush was a little, because of the privatization push, it was a little more complicated. But Clinton, Obama, I know people in the Trump world said he would be in that mindset, but he himself does not seem like that. So, is it possible that they'll be doing it? Sure. I mean, anything's possible, and logically you would think that you could do it. But I think if we keep being in this mindset of maybe in the second term, we've done it so many times where we've thought maybe in the second term they'll do it. I'm I'm setting my expectations accordingly.
Yeah, I understand.
What's your perspective on whether simply raising the retirement age is enough to make headway on the problem of funding the Social Security Trust Fund?
I mean, definitely raising the retirement age on its own is not enough. And this goes for almost any Social Security reform. What would have been enough 20, 30 years ago is not enough now because we have less runway. We have more folks who could have contributed, but who are now, either retired or going to be have been retired for longer, and so it's kind of too late to ask something of them. And so I think things like raising the retirement age have to be on the table, but we also need to be looking at higher revenue. We need to be looking at things like cost of living adjustments, the base benefit levels, at least for higher earners. I think really we have to be willing to put everything on the table for it because no one thing is going to solve the problem at this point.
All right, one more everything on the table question. Revenue has to be a big part of this. There's obviously a lot of talk in Washington around the corporate tax rate, getting companies to pay their fair share. But for years now, especially under Biden, there's been kind of a cap on we're not going to tax households over $400,000. Does that need to be
under $400,000?
Under $400,000, excuse me. Does that need to be kind of reconsidered in any one of these models?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we actually just put out a report on this last month, the problems with the $400,000 pledge. Number one, we're talking about 2% of households. Like about 2% of households have incomes over $400,000. So when you already take 98% of the country off the table from having to contribute, that creates both a math problem. There's a lot of income now off the table. And it's not just the income for those households. There's a significant share of income earned by high-income households that is below the threshold. So you make $500,000, that's 80% of your income is below $400,000. That can't be taxed. So it takes a lot off the table, but then I also think it poses a lot of governance questions. If we're telling 98% of the country we have a problem and don't worry, you don't have to deal with it, that really makes balancing the trade-offs a lot harder and really approaching the question of, is this worth it? That's a lot of folks who aren't engaged on it anymore.
Can I ask one final follow-up? How do you think about it with balancing some of the tax credit agenda that the Biden administration has had to push forth some of their other goals, like, their sustainability and, climate change goals, putting more EVs, electric vehicles, on the road by offering tax credits? Is there room for still that kind of approach to public policy, or is that leaving too much revenue kind of out of the equation?
I think the vast majority of policy proposals, I think, are affordable in some form. I mean, you have something like, universal basic income or Medicare for all that, really do struggle to make the math work. But I think any one thing is doable. You could do a bigger child tax credit. You could do the IRA provisions. You could do more generous healthcare subsidies. But the question is, you have to be able to balance the trade-offs and prioritize. You can do any of them, but you can't do all of them. And so I think there is a way to fit the clean energy agenda into that. It's just we have to then figure out how to pay for it.
Yeah.
What's your view on the Trump tax cuts that you mentioned? How politically difficult is that going to be to either change the structure or repeal them, when they expire next year?
I mean, it doesn't actually have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be complicated to repeal them. They are set to expire under current law. All we have to do is nothing and they go away. The problem,
under budget math, not under household math, right?
Yeah, I think it'll be. So the question is how expensive would it be to?
How expensive would it be to continue them? I guess I should put it that way. And then just how politically difficult would it be to not continue them?
Yeah. So in terms of how expensive it would be more than $3 trillion over the next decade. So that would be a lot more than those IRA clean energy tax provisions. How politically difficult would it be? I think it will be as politically difficult as members of Congress want to make it. I mean, I think Republicans will really double down on it. I think Democrats it used to be that the Biden $400,000 pledge was just, I'm not going to do any new tax policies that hit folks making under $400,000. And the implication of that was he is not wedded to making the Trump tax cuts that are currently there for people making under $400 permanent, but he has since changed that position to he wants to make them permanent. So if Democrats are going in the approach of we want to make the under 400 permanent and Republicans are saying we want to make all of them permanent, that leaves a much narrower band for negotiation and also means there's a better chance we get stuck with keeping most of them.
Which would make our fiscal position
that much worse.
A lot worse, especially if they're end up getting paired with additional corporate tax cuts.
I think it's less likely that they get paired with additional corporate tax cuts. I mean, we do have the tax, the bipartisan tax bill that's working its way through Congress that I think would make the problem a little bit worse if we then made those permanent without offset. But my actual bigger concern is that the Trump tax cuts, even though it was mostly a tax cut package, there were provisions that raised revenue, such as the SALT cap, and we've seen a big effort, a bipartisan effort to repeal some of those. Now, those also expire automatically. And so my bigger concern would be Congress making permanent the things that cost money and letting the ones that actually saved money expire. I think that would be the thing that makes it even more than $3 trillion.
Yeah, and politically difficult not to get rid of that as well.
I'm curious, as you guys have started to socialize this plan as the members behind it start to push it out, are you finding natural allies in this, whether it's from the business community or others, who else is kind of buying into this, if you will?
There's a long pause.
I think we're seeing I think the most obvious place we're seeing support is from a lot of economists, folks in the think tank space, people who are, who look at these issues and are really focused on solutions. I think we've seen some positive indications from folks like the ratings agencies, folks who look at the sustainability of our debt, who've said they would respond positively to something like a fiscal commission being established. I do think we've seen less activism from the business community compared to 10 years ago. And I think a big part of that is probably they have their tax cuts on the line, or some of their tax cuts on the line next year, and are wary of what would happen to them under that circumstance. But I think there is, again, I go back to the polling thing I said earlier. I think there is broad support. It's just not as vocal.
Great. Well, Ben, thank you so much for sharing your insights and for joining the show today. To our listeners, remember to like and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcasts. You can also follow us on LinkedIn at Penta Group and on X at PentaGRP. We're your hosts, Ylan Mui and Brian DeAngelis. And as always, thanks for listening to What's at Stake.